हेलो स्टूडेंट्स, वेलकम इन लेवल अप। आज हम लोग कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल गवर्नमेंट एंड डेमोक्रेसी इन इंडिया पढ़ेंगे, जो बीपीएससी 102 की है। इसका फर्स्ट चैप्टर आज हम लोग कंप्लीट करेंगे, जो है द मेकिंग ऑफ द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन। इसका फर्स्ट पार्ट है इंट्रोडक्शन। इंट्रोडक्शन देख लेते हैं। द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन ऑफ इंडिया बिकेम ऑपरेटिव ऑन 26 जनवरी 1950, 2 months after it was adopted on 26 November 1949. However, some provisions relating to election, citizenship provision, parliament, temporary and transitional provisions became effective after the adoption. The date, January 26, was significant since the Indian National Congress had first celebrated it as the Independence Day of the India in 1930. Okay, the Constitution is product of a long drawn process and deliberations. In this chapter, we will discuss some issue relating to the making of the Indian Constitution. Okay, we will discuss about issue what issue came in making of the Indian Constitutions. फर्स्ट चैप्टर एट ग्लैंस। फर्स्ट क्या है इसमें, इवोल्यूशन ऑफ द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन 1858 टू 1935 के बारे में हम लोग यहाँ से पढ़ेंगे। ठीक है, द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन वाज रिजल्ट ऑफ द डेलिब्रेशंस from December 9, 1947 to November 26, 1949 by the Constituent Assembly. Some of its features have evolved over three quarters of a century from 1858 to 1935 through various acts. The Constitution has provisions providing basic democratic rights and provisions for the ability of institutions for legislation, education, and judiciary. For the fulfillment these rights, it is also has a vision for social transformation and deepening of democracy in India. Okay. The Government of India Act 1935 and other acts. 1935 एक्ट के बारे में आपको डिटेल्स में पढ़ना, क्योंकि इसके बारे में बहुत सारे क्वेश्चंस भी आते हैं और इससे हमारे कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में बहुत सारे एक्ट्स भी लिए गए हैं। ठीक है, फ्रॉम 1858 टू 1935 the British government introduced certain rules of governance through different acts. The Government of India Act 1935 was the most important among them. Yes, मैंने इसको पहली बार डिस्कस कर चुका हूँ। The Government of India Act 1858 provided for a combination of centralized and decentralized power structure. Okay, the centralized structure was introduced in the areas which were under the direct control of the crown. These areas were called British India provinces. The centralized structure was introduced in the area which were not under the direct control of the crown. These areas were ruled by the Indian princes and were called princely estates. The princes had power to govern in all internal matters of their princely estates, but they are subject to the British control. In the British India provinces, the Secretary of State for India assisted by a 15-member Council of Ministers. ये आपको ध्यान रखना है, कितने के चाहिए, 15-member Council of Ministers. इसको ओवरलाइन कर लें या इसे आप नोट डाउन कर लें। Had all the power to govern on behalf of the crown. The Secretary of State of was assisted by the Viceroy. Okay, was assisted by an executive council. At the direct level, a small number of British administrators assisted the Viceroy. The provincial government did not have financial autonomy. The Council of India Act 1909 expanded the scope of political institutions in the provinces. This act introduced a representative element for the first time in British India, which include elected non-official members. This act also introduced separate representation of Muslim community. ये भी आपको ध्यान रखना है कि सेपरेट मुस्लिम कम्युनिटी यही बताया गया था। The Government of India Act 1919 delegated some authority to the provincial governments, retaining the control of the central government, मतलब unitary government, on them. It relaxed the control of the central government in a limited way and divided the subject for judiciary, of administration, and sources of revenue between center and provinces. Under the agreement, the provincial government was given control on resources of revenue such as land, irrigation, and judicial stamps. Okay, the provincial subjects were divided into transferred and reserved categories. The transferred subjects were governed by the governor, and reserved subjects were governed by the legislature. ये भी ये यहाँ से ए लाइन से लेके ए लाइन तक पूरा आपको मतलब एक तरह से आदि कर लेना है। ठीक है, द गवर्न एग्जीक्यूटिव हेड was not accountable to the legislature. ये सब आपको याद करने से की पॉइंट देने में इजी होगी आंसर राइटिंग में। चलिए आगे देखते हैं। द गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट 1935 वाज एन इम्पोर्टेंट एक्ट। हम लोग पहले भी डिस्कस कर चुके हैं कि 1935 एक्ट बहुत ज़्यादा इंपॉर्टेंट है हम लोग के लिए। अकॉर्डिंग टू एम गोविंदा राव एंड निविकर सिंह 2005, the act was a basic for the Constituent Assembly to make the constitution. This act provided for provincial government autonomy. Okay, it provided safeguards for minorities like provisions for separate representations to Muslims, the Europeans, Sikhs, Indian Christians and Anglo-Indians. Okay, याद रखना Anglo-Indians भी उसमें थे. This act gave three lists of divisions of power between the federation, central government, and provinces: federal, concurrent, and provincial. Under the act, a federal court was established to adjudicate disputes between the federation and provinces. Governor was the executive head of the provincial government, and he could veto the decision of the provincial legislature. He acted on behalf of the crown and enjoyed discretionary powers to exercise his individual judgments. In certain matters, he acted under the control of the Governor General and indeed the Secretary of the State. Okay. He was also not accountable to the legislature, but he was needed to act on the advice of ministers who were accountable to the legislature. The Government of India Act 1935 had a provision for sitting of a central government consisting of representatives from the provinces, areas ruled by the British India government, and the states, the areas covered under princely states. However, the federal government could not be formed because there was no unanimity among the princes to join the federation. Thus, the provincial governments could be formed as per this act. The election to the provincial legislature as per the Government of India Act 1935 was held in 1937. After the election, provincial governments headed by the Indian National Congress were formed in 8 provinces. The Indian National Congress government resigned in 1937. Okay. Freedom to legislature on certain limited matters under the control of the British India government. The report also prepared list of central and provincial subjects and fundamental rights. फंडामेंटल राइट्स आप लोग एक बार पढ़ लीजिएगा, ज़्यादा बेटर होगा. In 1934, the Indian National Congress demanded a constitution of Indian people without external interfaces. इसकी मैं एक अलग से क्लास लूंगा, सिर्फ फंडामेंटल राइट्स की. ये बहुत बड़ी चैप्टर है, इसकी मैं 2-3 क्लास लूंगा, इसको कंप्लीट करूंगा. फॉर्मेशन ऑफ द कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंट असेंबली का फॉर्मेशन कैसे हुआ? इसका फर्स्ट है द क्रिप्स मिशन. ओके, द ब्रिटिश गवर्नमेंट सेंट सर स्टॉफर्ड क्रिप्स. ये सब नाम बहुत ज्यादा जरूरी है, इस सब नाम को तो बिल्कुल आधी रखना है. Its cabinet member in 1942, the draft deliberation on proposals on the formation of constituent for Indians to be implemented at the end of the World War II. World War II में provided both the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress had agreed to accept them. The recommendation made in the draft proposals were dominion status to Indian with equal partnership of the British Commonwealth of Nations. All provisions ruled by the British India government and Indian states ruled by the Indian princes should form one Indian union by the British constitutions. The Constitution of India should be framed by an elected Constituent Assembly of Indian people, but if any province which was not prepared to accept the Constitution was to be free to retain its constitutional positions which had existed at that time. Okay. Such provinces were to be free to enter separate constitutional agreements. Both the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League rejected the proposals. इसमें मुस्लिम लीग और कांग्रेस दोनों इस प्रपोजल को रिजेक्ट कर दिए थे. द मुस्लिम लीग डिमांडेड दैट इंडियन शुड बी डिवाइडेड ऑन द कम्युनल लाइन्स एंड सम प्रोविंसेस शुड फॉर्म एन इंडिपेंडेंट स्टेट ऑफ पाकिस्तान एंड देयर शुड बी 2 कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंट असेंबलीज, वन फॉर इंडियन एंड अदर फॉर पाकिस्तान. ये आपको पता ही होगा जिन्ना साहब ने तो दो दो डिमांड की थी। जिन्ना साहब भी पाकिस्तान की माने जाते हैं। द कैबिनेट मिशन टू ब्रीड द to bridge the differences between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, the British government sent a delegation of the cabinet members, which came to know known as the Cabinet Mission Plan. It had three cabinet members. It जो लिखा ना इट हैड थ्री कैबिनेट मेंबर्स, ये तीनों नाम बहुत ज्यादा जरूरी, बहुत ज्यादा। लॉर्ड पैट्रिक लॉरेंस, सर स्टॉफर्ड क्रिप्स एंड एवी अलेक्जेंडर। ओके, ये तीनों आए थे, ब्रिटिश गवर्नमेंट ने भेजी थी इन लोगों को। द मिशन the mission failed to bring the two groups to an agreement. However, it made its own proposal, which was announced simultaneously on 16 May 1946 in England and in India. The recommendations made were there should be a union of India consisting of British India and the states with judiciary over subjects of foreign affairs, defense and communication. The provinces and states should have all judiciary powers. The union would have executive and legislature with the representative form of the provinces and the states. The provinces would be free to form groups with executives and legislatures, and each group would be free to decide on the provincial subjects. Election to the Constituent Assembly. Based on the proposals of the cabinet mission, the election to the Constituent Assembly was held. The members of the both Indian National Congress and the Muslim League were elected by the provincial assembly, legislative assembly. However, the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League differed on the inspirations of group clause of the cabinet mission. The British government intervened and explained that the contention of the Muslim League was correct. On December 6, 1946, the British government published a statement which for the first time acknowledged the possibility of two constituent assemblies and two states. Thus, the Constituent Assembly, which first met on December 9, 1946, was boycotted by Muslim League. Okay, nature of the Constituent Assembly representation. The representatives of the Constituent Assembly were indirectly elected by the restricted adult franchise, conformed to the elite sections of society, including the educated and taxpayers. इसमें ज्यादा ये जरूरी है, टैक्स पेयर्स में और एजुकेटेड थे, ठीक है। According to Greville Austin, the restricted franchise and indirect election to the Constituent Assembly members were expelled by the Cabinet Mission Plan to avoid the concurrence and slow process in the process of constitution making. Okay. The Cabinet Mission suggested the indirect election to Constituent Assembly by the elected members of provincial legislature. However, the Constituent Assembly represented different sets of opinions and religious communities of India. The Constituent Assembly had members with different ideological orientations and three religion communities: Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus, and all the other communities like the Anglo Indians, Parsis, etc. Majority of the Indian Constitution Assembly members were from the Indian National Congress. From then, a dozen members were non-Indian National Congress members, including A.K. Iyer, N.G. Anger, or H.N. Kurju, S.P. Mukherjee, and Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. S.P. Mukherjee represented the Hindu Mahasabha. The Constituent Assembly included representatives from the princely states also. Ambedkar was initially elected to the Constituent Assembly from Bengal as the member of the Scheduled Caste Federation, but lost this seat after the partition of Bengal and was re-elected by the Bombay and Indian National Congress as a non-Indian National Congress candidate at the request of Indian National Congress High Command. The Constituent Assembly sought to address concerns of every person irrespective of their social and cultural orientation. Thus, it held elaborate deliberations before incorporating a provision in the Constitution. The Constituent Assembly sought to accommodate universal values of democracy. The Constituent Assembly adopted several provisions from different constitutions of world and adapted them to the needs of India. While incorporating provisions, the Constituent Assembly adopted two wholly Indian concepts of resolving differences among its members, that is, consequence and accommodations. Most members of the Constituent Assembly took part in its proceeding, but about 20 individuals played at most influentially role in the assembly. Some of them Rajendra Prasad, Maulana Azad, Vallabhbhai Patel, Jawaharlal Nehru, Govind Vallabh Pant, P. Sitaramaya, A.K. Iyer, N.G. Iyer, A.M. Munshi, Dr. B.R. Ambedकर and सत्यराम नारायण सिन्हा. ये नाम तो फिर से मैं बोलूंगा याद रखना है, क्योंकि जितने आप पॉलिटी में नाम याद रखोगे उतने आप की पॉइंट बना पाओगे आंसर्स में. द कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंट असेंबली वाज द sole forum where deliberations took place, but the deliberations also happened in coordinations of the Indian National Congress Party and the interim government. Austin said Nehru, Patel, Prasad, and Azad had enjoyed unquestioned honor and prestige in the assembly. The Constituent Drafting Committee meticulously incorporated in the draft constitutions the discussions of Constituent Assembly. Dr. Bhir Ambedkar, chairman of the drafting committee, played the leading role in drafting committee of the Constitution. ये भी याद रखना है, डॉक्टर भीमराव अम्बेडकर चेयरमैन ऑफ द ड्राफ्टिंग कमेटी के चेयरमैन थे डॉक्टर भीमराव अम्बेडकर. ठीक है, आप लोग को अगर इसकी पीडीएफ चाहिए होगी तो आप लोग कमेंट कर दीजिएगा, हम लोग कमेंट में पिन करके उसमें डाल देंगे. ठीक है. The role of the Constituent Assembly in the making of the Indian Constitution 1946 to 1949. The Constituent Assembly held its inaugural sessions on 9 December 1946. Only 207 members attended it and the Muslim League members boycotted it. इसमें याद रखना कि इसमें 207 मेंबर्स ही अटेंड किए थे, जिसमें मुस्लिम लीग बॉयकॉटेड कर दी थी. डॉक्टर सचिदानंद सिन्हा was टेम्पोररी चेयरमैन ऑफ द हाउस. जब फर्स्ट बार चेयरमैन चुनने का बात हुआ तो जो सबसे एल्डर थे तो डॉक्टर सचिदानंद सिन्हा थे, इसलिए इसको फर्स्ट में बना दिया गया इसके चेयरमैन, बट बाद में इलेक्टेड किया गया और डॉक्टर राजेंद्र प्रसाद को बना दिया गया. इसका आगे पढ़ेंगे हम लोग. द मेंबर्स पास्ड रिजोल्यूशन ऑन 10 दिसंबर 1946. ये सब डेट भी याद रखें तो ज़्यादा बेटर होगा. फॉर इलेक्शंस ऑफ अ परमानेंट चेयरमैन on 11 December 1946, डॉक्टर राजेंद्र प्रसाद was elected as its permanent chairman. ठीक है, डॉक्टर राजेंद्र प्रसाद जाके जो आगे प्रेसिडेंट ही बनेंगे, जो 2 बार प्रेसिडेंट भी रहेंगे. On 13 December 1946, Jawaharlal Nehru moved resolution regarding the objectives of the Constituent Assembly. After that, different committees were formed. Some of the important committees were: first, Union Power Committee. It had 9 members and was chaired by Jawaharlal Nehru. ये सब अगर ये सब पॉइंट भी याद रखना है. जैसे में यूनियन पावर कमेटी है, इसमें 9 मेंबर्स थे और इसके चेयरमैन थे जवाहरलाल नेहरू. फिर सेकंड थी कमिटी ऑन फंडामेंटल राइट्स एंड माइनॉरिटी, इसमें 54 मेंबर्स थे और चेयरमैनशिप थी इसकी सरदार वल्लभ भाई पटेल. Steering committee, it has 3 members, included Dr. K. M. Munshi, chairman, Gopalaswamy Iyer, and Bhagwan Das. Okay. इसमें प्रोविंशियल कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन कमेटी, इट हैड 25 members and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel as its chairman. Committee on Union Constitutions. It had 15 members under the chairmanship of Jawaharlal Nehru. The Constituent Assembly appointed a drafting committee on 29 August 1947 under the chairmanship of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. The draft was prepared by Sir B. N. Rao. ये बी एन राव कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन बहुत अच्छे से तरीके से जाने जाते थे, इसलिए इसे हेल्प के लिए रखा गया था. एडवाइजर टू द कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंट असेंबली. ओके, ये बात मैंने पहले बताई. एडवाइजर थे कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंट असेंबली के. अ 7 member कमिटी वाज constituted to examine the draft. Ambedkar, who was also the law minister, piloted the draft in the assembly. The draft constitution was published in February 1948. ये भी याद रखना है, ये ड्राफ्ट कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन 1948 फरवरी में पब्लिश किया गया था. Its discussion by the Constituent Assembly was completed by October 17, 1949. This discussion was the second reading. ये जो October 17, 1949 को था, ये डिस्कशन सेकेंड रीडिंग था कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन का. ठीक है. और द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन असेंबली again met on 14 November 1949 to discuss the draft further or to give a third reading. इसमें थर्ड रीडिंग दिया गया. It was finalized. Sorry. On 26 November 1949, after receiving the signature of the President of the Constituent Assembly, on January 26, 1950, the Constituent was implemented. Okay, salient features of the Constitution. The Indian Constitution was prepared after ransacking all the known constitutions of the world. ठीक है, सारे वर्ल्ड के कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन के पढ़ने के बाद हमारा इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन बनाया गया है, क्योंकि सबके थोड़े छोटे पार्ट लिए गए हैं। इट इज द लॉन्गेस्ट रिटन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन। वर्ल्ड का सबसे लॉन्गेस्ट रिटन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन भी इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन है। इसे एलिफेंटियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन भी बोला जाता है। At the time of its formation, it had 395 articles and 8 schedules. आप देख सकते हैं उसी समय 395 आर्टिकल्स थे और 8 शेड्यूल्स थे, जो अभी बहुत सारे इसमें चेंजेस भी हुए हैं। It ensures both justiciable and non-justiciable rights, fundamental rights, and the directive principles of the state policy. Okay, जिसे DPSP भी बोला जाता है, Directive Principles of State Policy. It made provisions for universal adult franchise. The parliamentary system has been adopted from the British constitutions. जो parliamentary system है जो हम लोग ब्रिटिश कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन से लिए हैं, the provisions on the fundamental rights ये अमेरिकन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन से लिए हैं, और अमेरिकन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन से बहुत बड़ा चीज प्रियम्बल हम लोग अमेरिकन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन से ही लिए हैं। ठीक है, द डायरेक्टिव प्रिंसिपल्स ऑफ द स्टेट पॉलिसी हैव बीन adopted from the constitutions of Ireland. The emergency provisions are based on the constitutions of Germany, जिसे वेमार पहले बोला जाता था, अभी जर्मनी उसे हम लोग जानते हैं। द गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया एक्ट 1935, the borrowed features were modified as per the needs of our country. हम लोग पहले भी बताए थे 95 से बहुत सारा आर्टिकल्स लिए गए हैं और इसमें थोड़े से चेंजेस किए गए हैं जो हमारी कंट्री की नीड थी। ठीक है, यूनिवर्सल एडल्ट सफरेज एंड एवोल्यूशन ऑफ द सेपरेटेड इलेक्टोरेट। ओके, इस पे क्वेश्चन भी आ चुके हैं प्रीवियस ईयर में, इसलिए इसको थोड़ा डिटेल में देखते हैं। After debating its drafting list of fundamental rights, and subcommittee on fundamental rights did not recommended inclusion of all of them in the section 3 of the constitution as the fundamental rights. ये फंडामेंटल राइट्स आ रहा है, ये बहुत ज़्यादा हमारे लिए इम्पोर्टेंट है। जो फंडामेंटल राइट्स आर्टिकल 12 टू आर्टिकल 35 हमारे कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन में है। ठीक है, instead it suggested that this should be incorporated in other places in the constitution. One such example is that of the universal suffrage and secret and periodic elections. The subcommittee agreed unanimously in favor of the universal suffrage but suggested that it should not be part of the fundamental rights. यूनिवर्सल सफरेज को फंडामेंटल राइट्स के पार्ट में नहीं रखा गया। ठीक है, सीधा बात ये है। अकॉर्डिंगली इट was placed in the article 326 of the part 15 of on election. ठीक है, the word universal however is missing from the article 26 326, but the fact that every adult citizen of the country is entitled to vote makes it particularly a universal adult franchise. In fact, before Indians really got the right to universal adult franchise, the prominent leaders of the Indian national movement strove for the abolition of the separate electorate in favor of the joint electorate. The British had sought to continue separate electorate in India since the Morley Minto reforms. ये Morley ब्रिटिश था और मिंटो भी ब्रिटिश था, ये दोनों मिलके एक रूल बनाए गए थे, इसलिए उसे हम लोग मॉर्ली मिंटो रिफॉर्म्स बोलते हैं। ठीक है, ये 1909 में था टिल द कम्युनल अवार्ड इन 1932 इन द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन। ओके, द कम्युनल अवार्ड एम टू accord a separate electorate for Muslims, European, Sikhs, and Indian Christians and Anglo-Indians. It also provided for seats for the depressed classes which were to be filled in elections from a special constituency. In such constituencies, only the depressed classes could vote. In addition, the depressed classes were also entitled to vote in general constituencies. Gandhi opposed the recommendations of Nelson of separate electorate of the depressed classes. Okay, in opposition to the proposal of the separate electorate, he sat on fast up to death in September 1932. Gandhi's fast evoked opposition from Ambedkar. However, both Gandhi and Ambedkar reached compromise in Pune Pact. According to Pune Pact, seats were reserved for depressed classes in the general constituencies. This resulted in the abolition of the separate electorate. The abolition of separate electorate got reflected in the reservation of seats in the legislative body's constitution. Universal adult suffrage, abolition of the separate electorate. The Article 26 of the Part 15 of the Indian Constitution has the provisions for adult franchise. The subcommittee of the fundamental rights suggested that adult franchise should not be part of the fundamental rights. ये हम लोग पीछे भी पढ़ चुके थे. The word universal, however, is also not included. The permanent leaders of the Indian national movement sought for the abolition of the separate electorate in favor of the joint electorate. The British had sought to continue separate electorate in India since the Morley Minto reforms. ये मॉर्ली मिंटो में एक बार फिर बोल देता हूँ, ये अलग अलग ब्रिटिशर्स थे, ठीक है. ये मॉर्ली मिंटो, ये दोनों का अलग अलग थे, ये दोनों के नाम पे बनाया गया एक रिफॉर्म्स, ठीक है. 1909 till the communal award of 1932 in the constitution. The communal award aimed to accord separate electorate for Muslims, Europeans, Sikhs, Indians, Christians, and Anglo-Indians. It also provided for seats for depressed classes, which were to be filled in elections from a special constituencies. In such constituencies, only the depressed classes could vote. ये ध्यान रखना, डिफरेंट क्लासेस वोट कर सकते थे, कब, इन सच कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंसीज में, ठीक है. बिसाइड्स द डिप्रेस्ड classes were entitled to vote in general constituencies. Gandhi opposed the recommendations of the notion of separate electorates for the depressed classes. गांधी जी इसमें अपोज कर दिए कि इसमें यहाँ पे देखें कि डिप्रेस क्लासेस ही सिर्फ वोट कर सकते थे, नहीं, इसमें गांधी जी अपोज कर दिए, ठीक है. अपोजिंग द प्रपोजल फॉर सेपरेट इलेक्टोरेट ही सेट ऑन फास्ट unto death in September 1932. This was opposed by Ambedkar. Okay. However, Gandhi is Ambedkar reached a compromise in Pune Pact. ये हम लोग पहले पढ़ चुके हैं Pune Pact के बारे में, यहाँ पे पीछे, ठीक है. According to Pact, seats were reserved for the depressed classes in the general constituencies. This led to be the abolition of the separate electorates. The area covered under the princely estates. However, the federal government could not be formed because there was no unanimity, okay, among the princes to join the federation. Thus, the provincial governments could be formed as per this act. The election to be provincial legislature as per the Government of India Act 1935 was held in 1937. इसके बाद क्वेश्चंस हैं, प्रीवियस ईयर क्वेश्चंस हैं और कुछ सैंपल पेपर्स हैं. इसके बारे में हम लोग डिस्कस करेंगे, इस चैप्टर से क्या क्या क्वेश्चंस आ सकते हैं, ठीक है. इसके बारे में हम अगले लेक्चर में करेंगे, क्योंकि ये भी वीडियो बहुत लंबी हो चुकी है और मैं ज़्यादा वीडियो लंबा नहीं करना चाहता, आप लोगों को बोर नहीं करना चाहता, इसलिए चलिए खत्म.